Hello, everyone. So this week you are going to be reading some digital stories, and you're going to be doing some analysis of them. Last week you read Catherine Hale's article, Prentice Flat Code is Deep. So I want to take a few minutes and kind of walk through some of her main ideas and offer you some examples of what she is talking about. The article I don't think is especially hard, although she gets a little bit technical. So what I'm going to do, I created a PowerPoint and I'm going to share my screen with you. And we're just going to walk through some of her ideas. So from beginning. Okay, so here we go. Well, her first idea is digital texts are dynamic images. And I think you've probably seen that already, that their digital existence means that they can move or change. So one of the questions you want to keep in mind is, how does the movement within a digital story relate to what the writer's trying to say, what the story is all about, the theme, the point, or for you personally, the meaning? Why would a writer choose to integrate a particular movement? Last week you read Falco's Chemical Landscapes as one of our very first IDNs, and I hope you enjoyed it. I think it's very beautiful. But you may have noticed that as you click through the landscape, text appears and then disappears before you really have a chance to read it all. So there is a transient sense to the work. You are left with a sense of being unable to finish the text right before it disappears. So there's that sense of loss. It also adds to the dreamlike feel that the work has. And in fact, the content, this is a screenshot I made of one of the Lexia. And you can see that he is dealing with ideas about dreams, right? He's creating a dream-like experience. This is what Falco says. This is his artist statement. I have tried to time the fading in and out of the text so that it's almost impossible to read it all before it fades away. So he is inviting you to explore the text. You might have noticed too that there's no starting point other than that initial landscape. You can click anywhere on the initial landscape and enter the text, and you will encounter a different Lexia or a different screen. So the point, I moved on to another screen myself. The point I was going to say, and this is the point that Hales makes, is that the movement, ideally the movement should exemplify some significance to the content of the narrative itself. So it doesn't just occur because it's cool or interesting, but it should have some meaningful significance within the larger work. Here's another example of what I mean. This is Stuart Campbell's These Memories Won't Last. And in this, I will say the interactivity aspect of this particular IDN is it's really not that interactive. You're scrolling. That's about it. But it is interesting in that as you scroll, you're going to be scrolling down through the text, and the text and images move up. And as they do so, they fade. It's similar to Falco, but Stuart Campbell's project is quite a bit different. His work is a memoir of his memory or his life with his elderly grandfather who had dementia. And so the memories that don't, these memories won't last refers to the fact that the grandfather's memories were fading. And we as readers experience that same sense of loss, of the text disappearing, moving up. If you try scrolling backwards to try to see what you just read, you won't find it. The text actually fades into nothingness, just as the grandfather's memories were fading. So here's the point Hale is making. It's not dynamicism for its own sake, but rather the interplay between the text's physical characteristics and its signifying strategies. Okay, so she also says, the article also mentions as a further descriptive element of digital texts that they're generated through fragmentation and recombination. So the materiality of this particular genre invites this kind of movement. This kind of fragmentation is made available because of the power of coding, right? The power of hyperlinks. Every time you move through a piece, the term we use is an instantiation of the work. So it's a different instance. The story is not always the same, and you have to actually move through it and create that, create the story as an instantiated narrative. That's the phrase that Conantz uses. That's another text we're not reading in this class. But that is this notion of instantiated texts, that you have to actually go through them and you get something different, maybe from someone else, is really what gives rise to Hale's argument that a media-specific and analytic framework is necessary, that you can't just superimpose the traditional narratological frameworks on these kinds of electronic texts. Okay, so here's an example. This is the text, These Waves of Girls. So this is actually, it gets a little graphic, it's a little R-rated in places, I'll give you a heads up. It's not meant for under 18s, but it is a memoir of a girl's coming out. And the fragmentation is interesting. This example actually is a good example, not just of fragmentation, but also of navigation. Because even though the narrative is quite fragmented, as you click on each of the hypertext links, you end up in it's almost like an idea is exploded into greater detail. But at the same time, at certain points in the work, she has these arrows. Can you see? She has these arrows. So it's like she's saying, okay, we're gonna step away from the fragmentation for a little bit, and here is a portion of text that you can navigate linearly. So you have both this fragmentation and a linear ability. The term that we use for a screen, and this is a good example, when you have a screen like this with a chunk of text, we call this alexia, okay? And this actually is in itself a fragment of a larger text. Okay, so here we have another element. Digital text consists both of textons and scriptons. So those are probably two new terms for you. Basically, the texton refers to code. Scripton is what we see as readers. So this dimensionality, and this is how Hales distinguishes, one of the ways Hales distinguishes code from print is that code has this underlaying, I should say digital stories, have this underlaying layer of code, right? We get the text, what we see on the screen, and then we get what's behind it. Here is an example of what we mean. So this is simply HTML. The Canvas page that has the list of readings in this particular module, this is what the HTML code looks like for it. And I simply changed the scripton to red. So when you are looking at that particular screen as a student, you see what's in red, right? That's what I typed. Starting with this unit, you'll be engaged in something rare. But the texton is all the black that basically tells the computer how to render the script. What's sort of paradoxical is by going into the HTML screen and taking a screenshot of it, I have in effect rendered the texton as scripton. So in this particular moment, during this particular instantiation of my presentation, you have here texton as scripton because you can actually see the code. But really, it's normally what you would normally see. What you would normally see is scripton. You wouldn't normally see the code. I think Hales makes a really interesting point here on page 7 when she says an electronic text literally does not exist if it is not generated by the appropriate hardware running the appropriate software. Rigorously speaking, an electronic text is a process rather than an object. I think that is a very important thing to note. And I kind of want you to keep that in your mind, because this process facet of an electronic text lends it a fragility that an object does not have. We're going to come back to that. Okay, so Hales also identifies digital text as being mutable and transformable. So again, this is kind of enlarging what we looked at earlier in terms of movement and its transformative quality. So in other words, the text can change in very interesting ways. An example of that is Bouchardon's loss of grasp. We're actually going to we're going to play through that, read that, play through it in an upcoming unit, but I wanted to use it as an example here in terms of how digital texts transform. And really, this is something that is more characteristic of third wave IDNs. First wave, like Zork and some of the earlier narratives just did not have, there just wasn't the computing technology just wasn't there. In this particular story, the narrator is, through 6 different chapters or scenes, the narrator discusses or grapples with a sense of loss of control in his life. So Bouchardon exemplifies or allows us as readers to experience that as we navigate this text through some very interesting ways. So for example, initially, when you first enter the text, you can control how the sentences appear by moving your mouse, and then suddenly you become aware that your cursor's disappeared and your mouse isn't working on this particular screen anymore, and you don't have control now over when the next sentence appears. In another screen, I have this screen. This screenshot I have here is from one of the another chapter in the narrative. He encounters a woman and starts asking her questions, and as readers, as interactors, as Marie said, we can transform the text by moving our cursor, and as we move our cursor, the questions he's asking her appear, but at the same time, these questions merge. The text merges until it creates the image of the woman he's speaking to. And I thought that was a very interesting transformation because it exemplifies what is happening in the story at that particular point. Remember, and I'm going to come back to this, I'm coming back to this again, Hale's point is that materiality is important not just because it's cool, I think this is really cool, but because it forms part of the text signifying strategy. In other words, it's part of how the writer is telling the story. It's part of the narrative discourse. Oh my goodness, there I am using a traditional term from traditional narratology. But it fits in this case, right? It fits in this case. So as you're exploring some of the texts in this module, think about how the movement, the navigation, and some of the transformative qualities of the text are working to illuminate the point or the meaning of the story. What have I got next? Digital texts are spaces to navigate. So again, I think this is overlapping with some of the other points we've mentioned, but we do navigate in 2 different ways. The way that we're most interested in this class is really navigating through the visual interface. We're interested in navigating through the story itself. We're not really going to be getting into coding in any way in this course, mostly because I don't know anything about coding. We're just looking at this as stories. Still, so we navigate different ways. The stories that we're looking at in this particular module are, I think, mostly hyperlink, so just clicking on links or scrolling, right? But third wave IDNs expand into haptic interfaces, so that means like touchscreen, and that offers some very interesting and novel ways of navigating through a story. So an example of that is Gone Home. This is an iPhone app. Play it on my iPhone. it costs about $3 or $4. I'm hoping if you have an iPhone, you'll be willing to spring for that. But you use your touch screen to walk through an abandoned house and try to figure out what has happened. Similarly with the Stanley Parable, that's another really interesting existential story that we're going to be looking at. You explore an empty office building using your mouse. I tried using a controller, and the controller didn't seem to work. The game controller didn't seem to work that great. Mouse is fine. You do not need a game controller. Okay, so spaces to navigate. Okay, so we're getting near the end, but I think this particular element, this particular one is worth mentioning. Digital texts are written and read in distributed cognitive environments. All that means is that there are constituents beyond our brain that help us understand or remember, right? So, and you could argue that traditional books have that too, but when it comes to a digital text, it's a little more visceral, not visceral, but it's a little more tangible, right? Because you need a computer or you need an iPhone, you need the app, the software that goes with it, you need a power source, right? So you have the system by which the digital text is instantiated becomes more complex. So here we have what Hales says: when we read electronic hypertext, we do so in environments that include the computer as an active cognizer, performing sophisticated acts of interpretation and representation. So you're not by yourself anymore. In fact, in Bouchardon's Loss of Grasp, at one point, the computer, the text takes over your computer's camera and takes a picture of you as you're sitting at the screen, and that picture of you becomes part of the narrative. So that's a great example of how we have this much more distributed or complex system. So here is a question though. What happens when one part of an IDN's distributed cognitive environment fails, right? The more moving parts you have, the more opportunity you have for failure. A digital text is not an object the way a book is, and that is part of its fragility. Okay, so I really liked this paragraph from page 7. I think this is worth taking note of. This is what Hales says. The electronic author, I'm just going to go ahead and read it. You can mute me if you want. The electronic author who types the same sentence as someone who uses a typewriter then goes on to consider what behaviors and animations should attach to the words, in what font and color they should appear, on what background, etc., to what other texts or structures they should be linked, and so forth. In all these activities, the hardware and software are active partners. So there's that distributed cognitive environment, facilitating and resisting, enabling and limiting, enacting and subverting. The labor needed to program these efforts must be seen as intrinsic to the work of creation. So that's interesting. Now we're moving, you think about the solitary writer sitting in, her garret with the feather quill pen. Now we have something quite a bit different when it comes to creation or writing. Let me say, you are going to have a chance to try your hand at it in an upcoming unit. That's all I'll say for now. Okay. Finally, as you start to explore the text in this module, here are some questions I want you to keep in mind. And there's 6 of them here. How does the materiality of the story relate to its significance or its point? Why did the writer choose to integrate a particular element of movement, space, perspective, or fragmentation? How does this relate to theme or meaning? Here's a really important one. And this comes back to the fact that you have to have a different way of reading when you encounter these texts. You really need to read them or play through more than once and choose different options, because different things will happen. So here's the question. What happens is I play through multiple times choosing different routes. I really, really want you to do that to allow enough time to explore these stories more than once. How does the digital text function as a dynamically interacting whole? So think about that. We're kind of examining the different constituents, but then I want you to take a step back and think about how it works as a whole. And then how does the digital text resist a traditional narrative approach? Like, what is that tension between thinking of an IDN as a story and thinking of it as really kind of a computer program, a process instead of an object? Okay, well, I look forward to seeing what you come up with, and let me know if you have any questions. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to stop recording. Let me know if you have questions.